Sometime in the summer of 1915, in a field hospital in France, a doctor bent over the ruined left hand of a British officer and delivered his verdict. 2 of the fingers were beyond saving. They would have to come off. But the hospital was overwhelmed. The queue for surgery was long, and the officer was told he would have to wait his turn. The officer, it is said, decided he was not prepared to wait, and dealt with the ruined fingers himself, there and then, before asking the doctor to get on with the rest. The officer's name was Adrian Carton de Wiart, and by the time that particular afternoon arrived, he had already lost an eye, been shot through the face, and formed the settled opinion that being wounded was simply part of a soldier's ordinary working life. He would go on to be shot through the skull, the hip, the leg, the ankle, and the ear. He would survive 2 aeroplane crashes, swim away from one of them into the open sea, and later tunnel out of a prisoner of war camp in his 60s. He would be wounded so many times, in so many places, across so many wars, that the simple fact of his survival begins to look less like luck and more like some stubborn refusal of his body to accept what was happening to it. And yet, the most extraordinary thing about Adrian Carton de Wiart is not the sheer catalogue of his injuries, remarkable as it is. It is what he thought about all of it. Because after a lifetime of being shot almost everywhere a man can be shot, of losing pieces of himself on battlefields across half the world, he sat down to write his memoirs and summed the whole experience up in 5 words that ought to be impossible. Frankly, he wrote, I had enjoyed the war. This is the story of the man who could not be killed, and who, stranger still, would not have wanted to miss a moment of the trying. He was not by birth even entirely British. He was born in Brussels in 1880, of Belgian and Irish descent, into a well-to-do family, and he grew up partly in Belgium, partly in Egypt, speaking several languages, and destined, his father hoped, for a respectable career in the law. His father was a successful lawyer and later a judge, and had every expectation that his clever, well-connected son would follow him into a comfortable professional life. The young Adrian was duly sent to Oxford to study law, but the young Carton de Wiart had no interest whatsoever in the law. What he wanted was soldiering and adventure. When the Boer War broke out in South Africa at the turn of the century, he saw his chance and took it in the most direct way imaginable. He abandoned his studies at Oxford without hesitation. He was too young to enlist and had no permission from his father, so he simply lied, gave a false name and a false age, and signed on as an ordinary trooper, a private soldier, to get himself out to the fighting in South Africa. It was an astonishing thing for a wealthy young gentleman of his background to do, throwing away a guaranteed future to serve in the ranks under an invented identity. And it very nearly ended before it began, because he was wounded in the stomach and the groin almost at once, and shipped home. When his horrified father learned what his son had done, not just enlisting, but being invalided home shot through the belly, there was, one imagines, a difficult conversation. But the essential thing had been settled. It was the first installment of a debt to war that would go on being paid in blood for the next 40 years. Carton de Wiart had found his calling, and no disapproval and no wound was going to talk him out of it. The wound that would define his appearance for the rest of his life came in 1914, in one of the more obscure corners of the war, in the deserts of Somaliland, where British forces were fighting the followers of a local leader the British called the Mad Mullah. During an assault on an enemy fort, Carton de Wiart was shot twice in the face. He lost his left eye and part of his ear. Sent back to recover, he was fitted with a glass eye, which he wore just long enough to get out of the hospital, whereupon he found it so uncomfortable that he threw it out of the window of a taxi and bought himself a black eye patch instead. It was that eye patch, together with the empty sleeve that would soon join it, that gave him for the rest of his life the appearance that one observer described perfectly. He looked, they said, like an elegant pirate. He regarded the loss of the eye, characteristically, as something close to a lucky break, because it got him out of the sideshow in Somaliland and back to Europe, where the First World War was now raging and where, in his view, the real action was to be found. And it was on the Western Front, in the mud and wire of that war, that Carton de Wiart's body began to be taken apart, piece by piece, in earnest. The list is almost numbing to read. Over the course of the First World War, he was wounded 8 separate times. He was shot through the skull and survived. He was shot through the hip at Passchendaele. He was shot through the leg at Cambrai. He was shot through the ankle at the Somme and through the ear at Arras. And in 1915, near Ypres, he was hit in the hand so badly that it led to that scene in the field hospital. The ruined fingers he dealt with himself when the surgeon could not get to him fast enough. A fellow officer who was there when the hand was first wounded left a small, telling account of the moment. The blow did not stop Carton de Wiart, he recalled. The man simply carried on, though, as the officer put it, with enormous understatement. His language was awful. He must have been in agony. But he did not check his stride. The hand could not be saved, and eventually the whole of it was amputated. So he fought on with one eye and one hand, and somehow this did not slow him down at all. He learned to do everything one-handed that other men did with two, and he did it without complaint, as though the missing hand were a minor administrative inconvenience, rather than the loss of half of his grip on the physical world. It is worth pausing on what fought on actually meant for a man in his condition, because Carton de Wiart was not a general who directed battles from a safe distance behind the lines. He was the opposite. He commanded from the very front, in the worst places, and he led from there in a manner that seems almost unhinged by any ordinary standard. And it produced, in July 1916, at the Battle of the Somme, the single action that would win him Britain's highest award for valour. It happened at a place called La Boisselle, one of the strongest German positions on that terrible battlefield. Carton de Wiart was commanding an infantry battalion, part of an attack that quickly fell into chaos as the commanding officers of the neighbouring battalions were killed or wounded one after another. With the attack on the verge of collapse and the officers around him falling, Carton de Wiart simply took command of all of them, 3 shattered battalions besides his own, and held the whole thing together by sheer force of personality. He moved up and down the line through the storm of fire, organising, steadying, refusing to let the position break, and, unable to pull the pins from his grenades with a hand he no longer had, he pulled them out with his teeth and threw the grenades one by one with his single good arm. For this, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration a British soldier can receive, for most conspicuous bravery, coolness and determination, in the words of the citation, during operations that saw 3 other battalion commanders fall while he held their ground at all costs. It is one of the most remarkable Victoria Cross actions of the entire war, and here is perhaps the most telling detail of the whole story. When Carton de Wiart came, years later, to write his memoirs, he did not even mention the Victoria Cross. To him, apparently, it was not worth the space. The most extraordinary act of his life was, in his own estimation, simply another day at the office. When the First World War ended, a man who had lost an eye and a hand and had been wounded 8 times might reasonably have been expected to retire quietly and count himself lucky to be alive. Carton de Wiart did nothing of the kind. He went looking for the next war. He found it in Poland, which in the years after 1918 was fighting for its very existence against a whole ring of enemies at once: the Soviets, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, and he served there with the British military mission, surviving, along the way, an ambush by Cossacks and yet another aeroplane crash. And then, when the fighting in Poland at last died down, he did something that tells you as much about the man as any battlefield. He settled down in the remote marshes of Poland and spent 15 years there, largely occupied with hunting and shooting, and he loved it. In his memoirs, he wrote that he shot on almost every one of those days, and that the pleasure of it never once palled. It is a strange, quiet interlude in the middle of so much violence. The unkillable soldier, at peace at last in the marshes, waiting, though he did not yet know it, for the next war to come and find him. It came in 1939. When Germany invaded Poland and set the world alight for a second time, Carton de Wiart, now approaching 60, with one eye and one hand, and a body that was a roadmap of old wounds, did not hesitate for a moment. He was recalled to his old post as head of the British military mission to Poland, and arrived just in time to watch the country he loved be crushed between Germany from the west and a fortnight later, the Soviet Union from the east. He escaped the closing trap, made his way out through Romania, and got himself home, and immediately asked for more. He got it. In the spring of 1940, he was given command of an Anglo-French force sent to central Norway, part of the disastrous Allied attempt to contest the German invasion of that country. It was a hopeless operation from the start. Too few men, almost no air cover, troops landing in the snow without proper equipment against an enemy who held every advantage. Carton de Wiart handled the impossible situation with his usual unflappable calm, conducting a fighting withdrawal and getting as many of his men away as he could under constant air attack before the whole Norwegian adventure was abandoned. It was not a victory. Almost nothing in that first year of the war was, but it was another campaign survived, another disaster walked through by a man who by now seemed to treat catastrophe as his natural working environment. And then, in 1941, his war took its strangest turn of all. He was sent to lead a British military mission, and his aircraft was shot down over the Mediterranean, crashing into the sea a mile or so from shore. Knocked unconscious by the impact, he came round in the cold water, and, one-handed, past 60, far from young, he swam for the shore and helped others do the same, only to be captured on landing by Italian troops. What followed was, if anything, the most entertaining chapter of the whole saga. As a prisoner of war in a castle in Italy, Carton de Wiart proved utterly incapable of sitting still. Over the next 2 years, he took part in no fewer than 5 separate escape attempts. On one occasion, he and his fellow prisoners spent 7 months digging a tunnel through solid rock, and when Carton de Wiart got out through it, he managed to remain at large for 8 days, disguised as an Italian peasant, a performance made all the more astonishing by the fact that he was a one-handed, one-eyed man in his 60s with an unmistakable bearing, who could not speak more than a word or two of Italian. That he lasted 8 days at all is a small miracle of sheer nerve. In the end, the war reached even into his captivity in the strangest way. The Italians, on the point of changing sides, decided that the famous one-eyed British general might be useful to them, and they released him to help with the negotiations that took Italy out of the war. And so Carton de Wiart, prisoner 1 week, was suddenly a free man again, and almost immediately Churchill, who admired him enormously, sent him halfway across the world once more, this time to China, as his personal representative. Even now, in his 60s, the old soldier's odyssey was not finished. On the way, he crashed yet again and broke his back and carried on regardless. It would be easy to turn him into nothing more than a cheerful cartoon of indestructibility, and he was more complicated than that. He lived for war in a way that can be uncomfortable to contemplate. The same relish that made him magnificent in battle meant he gave startlingly little thought, in his memoirs, to the horror of it all, or to the ordinary men who did not come home. His famous phrase, that he had enjoyed the war, is thrilling and appalling in almost equal measure, and it is worth remembering that the wars he enjoyed so much were, for most of the men who fought in them, the worst thing that ever happened to them. His courage was beyond question, but his was a temperament from another age, and we can admire the astonishing resilience without pretending the appetite behind it was entirely comfortable. And yet, when all of that is said, the sheer scale of what his body endured and shrugged off remains almost impossible to take in. Shot in the face, the skull, the hand, the hip, the leg, the ankle, the ear, and the stomach. An eye lost, a hand lost, ruined fingers he dealt with himself rather than wait for a surgeon. 2 aircraft crashes survived, a broken back, a swim away from a sinking plane, a tunnel dug out of a prison in his 60s. By any reasonable reckoning, any one of a dozen of these things should have ended him. None of them did. One writer put it more simply than any medical explanation ever could. He did not know how to die, so he simply survived. In the end, the man that war could not kill was allowed, at last, to grow old. After a lifetime of being shot at on 4 continents, Adrian Carton de Wiart finally laid down his sword, settled in the quiet green countryside of County Cork in Ireland, and lived out his last years in peace. He remarried, he fished, he told his stories, and on a June day in 1963, at the age of 83, the unkillable soldier died quietly in his own bed. The one fate, perhaps, that all those bullets and crashes and prison camps had never managed to arrange for him. He had walked through the fire of half the 20th century's wars and left pieces of himself on battlefields from Africa to Flanders to Italy, and come home each time, until there were no more wars to come home from. And whatever we make of a man who could write, after all of that he had frankly enjoyed it, there is no denying the strange, stubborn magnificence of the life. He was, quite simply, one of the most extraordinary soldiers Britain ever produced. A man who was shot almost everywhere it is possible to be shot, and who kept getting up, again and again, until old age itself finally did what the enemy never could. If someone in your family served in the wars of the last century and carried their own scars home, seen or unseen, we would be honoured if you would share their story with us in the comments below, so that the ordinary courage of extraordinary men is remembered by name.